On a warm, late summer evening in 2002, Brian Keller and his girlfriend Lila Rhodes left a family barbecue in a small valley town at the base of the mountains. Friends remembered them carrying leftovers wrapped in foil, laughing as they said goodbyes. They were expected to make the short drive home up a narrow mountain road they'd taken dozens of times before. It wasn't far, just 35 minutes from the valley to their rented house perched on the ridge. They left just before dusk, with Brian driving his green Jeep Cherokee and Lila riding in the passenger seat. That road was familiar, but it was also dangerous. It wound tightly along cliffs and sharp turns, with few guardrails. Locals knew it as a place where even a small mistake could have fatal consequences. But that night, there were no signs of an accident. No one in their families knew it at the time, but it would be the last confirmed sighting of either of them. The next morning, the first sign of trouble came when Brian's sister stopped by their house and found their driveway empty. She assumed they might have stayed overnight at the barbecue or maybe decided to take a detour into town. But by the afternoon, unease started to grow. Lila's mother called the house repeatedly, each time reaching voicemail. By evening, concern had spread between the families. Brian was expected back at work at the auto shop, and Lila was supposed to open at the diner where she waitressed. Neither showed up. Both were reliable, both known for being on time. It wasn't like them to disappear without a word. The families exchanged calls that night, their voices shifting from annoyance to fear. By the second morning, when neither had returned home and neither had contacted friends, the families reported them missing. Police treated the case with immediate seriousness. Two adults vanishing together was unusual, and the mountain road they were last known to be on was notorious for sudden accidents. Officers began with the obvious. They checked hospitals and tow records, then extended to local highway patrol for accident reports. Nothing matched. No Jeep had been recovered, no injuries matching their names. It was as if the couple had simply driven into the night and vanished. Sheriff's deputies organized an initial ground search that same day. They drove the length of the mountain road, stopping at each turnout, each ravine, looking for broken branches, skid marks, or fresh tire tracks. Helicopters circled above, scanning for glints of metal that could indicate a vehicle gone off the road. Divers were dispatched to the reservoir at the base of the valley, though it was miles from their route. The first sweep turned up nothing. The Jeep wasn't there. The couple wasn't there. What troubled searchers most was the absence of any disturbance. On that road, accidents left clues, scars on guardrails, drag marks on asphalt, oil spills. This time there was only silence, the kind that pressed down, heavier with each passing hour. For the families, the search quickly turned from shock into despair. Neighbors and volunteers joined in, walking the tree line, peering down ravines with binoculars, calling out their names into empty air. Flyers were printed overnight and posted in gas stations, grocery stores, rest stops along the interstate. The photograph on every flyer showed them smiling side by side, Brian with his baseball cap, Lila with her hair pulled back, both of them appearing young and full of life. The picture became the last trace of them the public would see. As the days went on, more resources were thrown into the effort. Search dogs were brought in, but they couldn't pick up a consistent trail. The road itself was deceptive. Heavy winds and traffic quickly erased any scent. Deputies marked every area of loose soil that might have given way under tires. Climbers scaled down parts of the ravine searching for debris. Still, nothing surfaced. Each failed sweep chipped away at confidence, but the families pushed for more. They couldn't accept that two people and an entire vehicle could vanish on a stretch of road so close to town. Authorities considered possibilities. Perhaps the Jeep had careened into a body of water too deep to see, or maybe both had chosen to run away intentionally. But friends and co-workers rejected the runaway theory outright. Brian had steady work and plans to take over his uncle's shop. Lila had just spoken about saving for nursing school. Their lives were anchored. They had no reason to leave, and no sign pointed to them preparing to do so. By the end of the first week, the case was already drawing attention from local media. Reporters described it as a vanishing drive, a disappearance that defied the usual patterns of missing person cases. For the community, The disappearance was unsettling not only for its mystery, but for what it implied, that anyone could take that road one evening and never return. Rumors began circulating, but the evidence was scarce. Families gathered nightly, waiting for updates, each hour lengthening the silence between what they hoped and what they feared. As days turned into weeks, the investigation grew colder, but the initial stage left one haunting impression on everyone involved. The couple had disappeared without leaving behind a single trace. That absence was more disturbing than any confirmed tragedy. It suggested something hidden, something buried, waiting beyond the reach of the first searches, and it set the stage for the long, painful mystery that would stretch across decades until a rockslide many years later would finally disturb the silence and reveal part of the truth. Search efforts along the mountain highway began at dawn, with deputies and volunteers fanning out along the twisting asphalt that cut between steep drops and dense forest. The road was unforgiving, with hairpin turns and blind corners where accidents were common. But as the searchers advanced mile by mile, what unsettled them most was the lack of any sign of struggle or crash. At each guardrail, deputies crouched to inspect for fresh dents, chips of paint, or scraped metal, but every barrier stood intact. It was as if the Jeep had never touched the road beyond the night it vanished. Helicopters circled above, their spotlights sweeping across rocky ledges and deep ravines where cars had been found in the past. From the air, nothing reflected back, no shattered windshield, no twisted frame, no debris field. Divers entered streams that crossed under the road, sliding into the frigid water with ropes tethered to their waists. They probed the muddy bottoms where vehicles sometimes settled, hidden from the naked eye. Hours passed, but the reports were always the same. Clear water, no sign of a car. The Jeep, with its bright green paint and heavy build, should have stood out immediately. Its absence gnawed at the searchers. By the third day, it was not just a matter of where Brian and Lila might have gone. It was how an entire vehicle could vanish without leaving the faintest trail. The family stayed close to the search zone, often waiting at checkpoints or rest areas where deputies staged operations. They brought coffee and sandwiches, trying to contribute, their exhaustion written plainly across their faces. Lila's mother clutched her daughter's photo in a plastic sleeve, showing it to volunteers even though everyone already knew who they were looking for. Brian's father walked the shoulders of the road himself, peering down embankments as if sheer determination might uncover what technology and manpower had failed to see. Their hope clashed with the growing unease of investigators who had begun whispering darker theories. Sheriff's deputies quietly debated foul play. If the couple had been forced off the road, there should have been evidence: skid marks, broken vegetation, drag marks in the soil. Yet none of that was present. The Jeep had not swerved, had not hit, had not rolled. The complete absence of physical signs suggested another possibility: that the couple had never made it far along that road in the first place. Detectives considered whether they could have been intercepted, stopped before the steepest section. Perhaps someone had followed them out of the valley and forced them to turn. Such thoughts were voiced cautiously because they carried implications the families were not ready to hear. Rumors began to spread through the small towns below the mountain. At gas stations and diners, locals speculated about what had really happened. Some suggested they staged their own disappearance, running off together for reasons unknown. Others leaned on a darker narrative: an abduction, a crime hidden in plain sight. The sheriff's office didn't endorse any theory publicly, but behind closed doors, the absence of evidence pushed them toward uncomfortable conclusions. Investigators ran checks on known offenders in the region, questioned those recently released from prison, and cross-checked vehicles that had been stopped near the mountain road that week. Nothing connected. Every lead hit a wall of silence. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of failure grew heavy on the search teams. Many of the volunteers were locals who had seen countless accidents on that road and believed they knew what to expect. They thought they would find a mangled vehicle at the bottom of a ravine, a sight as tragic as it was familiar. But this time, there was nothing. No wreckage, No bodies, not even a scrap of fabric or a license plate torn loose by impact. The lack of debris made the case stand apart, and not in a comforting way. It hinted at control, as though whatever had happened to Brian and Lila had been carefully orchestrated, leaving no accident scene behind. The families clung to any remaining possibility that the couple might still be alive. Friends suggested they could have taken an unplanned detour or pulled off to rest somewhere isolated. Deputies entertained those theories, checking cabins, abandoned campsites, and logging roads. But the further they looked, the more implausible it seemed. Vehicles did not just disappear. Even when stolen, even when abandoned, traces always remained. Yet the Jeep was gone, as if it had been erased. The investigators were left with a troubling choice: treat the disappearance as a tragic accident with no scene, or escalate it into a criminal investigation with no evidence. Both paths were unsatisfying. One offered no closure, the other no direction. What haunted the searchers most was the silence of the road itself. A stretch known for chaos had given back nothing, not even a single clue to explain how two people could drive into the night and never arrive. That silence would only deepen the mystery, and it left a question lingering among both police and family members. If they didn't crash and they didn't run, then what force had taken them off that road without a trace? As the days turned into weeks with no breakthrough, the investigation began to seep beyond the road and into the small valley towns below. The disappearance of Brian and Lila became less of a police file and more of a ghost story locals carried with them into diners, gas stations, and corner stores. With no car, no debris, and no explanation, speculation took hold in a way that facts never could. People whispered about feuds that had never healed, debts that might have come due, and shadows on the highway no one could quite identify. Each rumor painted a new version of the same night, and each one added a layer of doubt to what anyone thought they knew. Police collected dozens of statements, following every lead, no matter how thin. One man swore he had seen Brian arguing with someone outside a bar 2 weeks before the disappearance, insisting it was over money owed from a failed car sale. But when pressed, the details faltered. He couldn't name the bar, couldn't recall the date, and no one else remembered the fight. Another story came from a family who had driven that same road the night the couple vanished. They claimed they saw a man hitchhiking near mile marker 12, tall, unshaven, holding a duffel bag. The description was vague, but the timing placed him directly on their path. Deputies canvassed the area, questioned transient workers and known drifters, yet no one resembling the hitchhiker could be identified. Even stranger were the accounts that seemed to place the couple themselves in different places after they were supposed to be gone. A store clerk told deputies that Lila had come into her shop the next morning, buying bottled water and bread. She described her as tired, with hair pulled back and wearing a gray sweatshirt. But security footage was checked, and the tape from that day was blank, an equipment failure that left nothing to confirm or deny the sighting. The clerk stood by her story, but investigators noted how quickly word of the case had spread and how easy it was to misremember faces once flyers were everywhere. Another report came from a farmer who lived off a dirt road that branched from the highway. He claimed he saw headlights near his property around midnight, pausing at the end of his drive before disappearing back toward the main road. He told deputies he was sure it was the missing Jeep, but from his porch more than 100 yards away, there was no way to confirm the make or model. When police asked why he hadn't reported it sooner, he admitted he didn't think much of it at the time. To him, it was just another set of lights in the night. Only later, when the search grew frantic, did he start to wonder if it meant something more. Contradictions piled up. Some locals insisted Brian and Lila had been planning to leave the area, that they had spoken about starting over in another state. Friends close to them rejected that entirely, pointing out that Lila had just applied for nursing classes at a local college, and Brian was arranging financing to buy into his uncle's garage. Others suggested they might have been followed from the barbecue by someone with a grudge. Deputies traced every guest who had attended that night, but all alibis checked out. There was no clear conflict, no brewing fight, no argument anyone could recall that might explain a disappearance. For investigators, the flood of statements was less a map forward and more a maze. Each lead seemed promising until it collapsed under its own weight. The hitchhiker could not be found. The store clerk's account lacked proof. The farmer's headlights could have belonged to anyone. Even the rumor about debts dissolved when financial records showed both Brian and Lila had steady, modest accounts with no signs of trouble. It was as though the valley itself was filling the silence with theories, each one more dramatic than the last, because the truth was too hard to face, that there were no answers, no evidence, and no way to explain how two people could disappear so completely. By the end of the month, the sheriff's office admitted publicly that every lead had dissolved into contradictions. The case had grown larger than their resources could manage, with tips pouring in faster than they could be checked. Families who had once believed every phone call might bring a breakthrough now answered with dread, knowing it would most likely be another rumor that unraveled the moment it was tested. The whispers in town continued, but the official investigation stalled, weighed down by too many stories and not enough facts. And as the silence of the mountain road stretched longer, the question began to shift from where the couple had gone to whether they had ever made it past that road at all. Weeks turned into months, and what had begun as a frantic search with helicopters, deputies, and divers slowly shifted into something much more personal. The families of Brian and Lila took over where law enforcement resources began to thin. They printed thousands of flyers, each one carrying the same photographs and the same plea for information, and drove them across counties and state lines. Truck stops, interstate rest areas, and small-town bulletin boards became plastered with their faces. Volunteers joined in at first, but as time passed and the story slipped from headlines, it was mostly the families who kept the search alive. They organized weekend efforts, combing back trails and abandoned shacks in the foothills. Every shadow was studied as if it could hold an answer. Every discarded item was picked up, held, and scrutinized, no matter how ordinary. Search dogs were brought in more than once, but they could only take investigators so far. Handlers reported that the dogs caught a trace of scent along a particular curve in the road, a sharp bend where the shoulder narrowed against a steep drop. Each time, the animals would strain, then lose the trail as if the scent dissolved in midair. Deputies theorized the jeep could have gone off at that point, hidden deep beneath foliage or rocks, but multiple searches along that ravine turned up nothing. For the families, that curve became a symbol. It was the place where hope bent, where the last connection to Brian and Lila seemed to vanish. Parents returned to it often, standing on the shoulder in silence, staring down into the trees, waiting for some detail to surface. Nothing ever did. Tensions rose between the families and the sheriff's department. Deputies were blunt about the limits of manpower. They admitted they could not dedicate full-time resources indefinitely to a case with no new evidence. For the parents, those words felt like abandonment. They had trusted that law enforcement would see the search through until an answer was found, and now they were being told to prepare for the possibility that none would be. Arguments erupted in meetings with family, members accusing investigators of giving up too soon. The sheriff's office countered that every logical avenue had been exhausted. Each side walked away feeling betrayed, and the case settled into an uncomfortable standoff. Within the families themselves, fractures began to show. Some held to the belief that Brian and Lila had chosen to leave together, eloping without warning, starting over somewhere far from the valley. It was the only explanation they could live with, because it meant the couple might still be alive. Others found that idea impossible. They pointed to the belongings left behind, the savings untouched, the plans the two had made for the months ahead. To them, the silence suggested something much darker, and the thought of a predator still roaming the mountains haunted every sleepless night. Those arguments often ended in bitterness, each side clinging to its version of hope. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of the search. In autumn, leaves carpeted the road and obscured any sign of disturbance. In winter, snow buried the shoulders of the highway, making it impossible to check ravines. Spring brought meltwater that surged through the gullies, carrying away whatever might have been hidden. With each season, the chance of finding something seemed to slip further from reach. Parents described it as watching doors close one by one, each turn of the calendar taking them further from the night their children were last seen. Despite the passage of time, there were still moments when new hope briefly flared. An abandoned campsite discovered in the hills. A report of two people matching their descriptions seen at a gas station hundreds of miles away. A phone call from someone convinced they had overheard a conversation about the missing Jeep. But each time, the lead collapsed under scrutiny. The campsite belonged to hunters. The gas station sighting was a couple from Oregon. The overheard conversation turned out to be nothing more than rumor. These dead ends began to weigh heavily, leaving the families feeling as if they were chasing ghosts. What made it worse was the silence that followed them home. Their houses, once filled with photos and laughter, became shrines to absence. Brian's room remained untouched, his work boots lined by the door. Lila's journals were stacked neatly on her dresser, pages filled with plans that would never unfold. The parents lived in limbo, unable to grieve fully and unable to move forward. They waited by phones that rarely rang, checking the mail for letters that never arrived, staring at doorways in case someone walked through. The stillness was suffocating. By the first anniversary of their disappearance, the case had grown colder than anyone wanted to admit. Law enforcement referred to it only when pressed, and the families were left to navigate their grief largely alone. Yet the mystery refused to fade. Neighbors spoke of the couple in hushed tones, reminding each other that no one had ever been found. The mountain road remained the same, winding, dangerous, and silent. But for the families, it was no longer just a road. It was the last place they knew Brian and Lila had been, and it carried the weight of everything they had lost. The longer the search dragged on, the more it shifted from action to endurance. Families stopped expecting breakthroughs and started bracing themselves for silence. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was a lingering fear no one could shake, that whatever had taken Brian and Lila was still out there, watching the road, hidden in the same silence that had swallowed the Jeep without a trace. By the 5th year, the disappearance of Brian Keller and Lila Rhodes was no longer at the center of nightly news broadcasts or urgent press briefings. What had once been a case that gripped the valley now sat in a cold file cabinet, reduced to folders stacked on metal shelves deep inside the sheriff's office. Detectives who had once walked every mile of the mountain road retired or were reassigned. Volunteers who had once lined up to join search parties drifted back to their lives, their energy drained by years of fruitless efforts. Other tragedies demanded attention, new crimes, new missing persons, new emergencies that pulled both manpower and funding away. The silence around the couple's case grew heavier, not because the questions were answered, but because time made them easier to ignore. The families fought against that silence as long as they could. On the 5th anniversary, they placed flowers at the curve in the road where search dogs had once lost the scent and where the last fragile connection seemed to have ended. A small wooden sign was nailed into the soil nearby, carved with their names and the date they vanished. Passing motorists slowed when they saw it, sometimes stopping to leave candles or notes. For a while, the memorial felt like a lifeline, proof that the community hadn't forgotten. But seasons wore the paint, storms splintered the wood, and the sign became just another weathered marker on a dangerous road. Fewer cars stopped, fewer people remembered. Time eroded memory, but not for everyone. In the sheriff's department, there were investigators who never stopped thinking about the case. Some kept the file open on their desks, thumbing through reports as if a missing detail might suddenly leap out years later. They couldn't reconcile the impossibility of it, that 2 young adults and a Jeep could vanish so completely on a public road without leaving behind wreckage, footprints, or witnesses. For them, it was less a cold case and more an unsolved equation. The pieces refused to fit. A road with no guardrail damage, no debris, no physical evidence of a crash, and no indication of voluntary disappearance. Something about it was unfinished, as if the mountain was holding its own secrets, unwilling to let them surface. Family members tried to press officials for updates, but most of the responses grew colder with time. Letters from the sheriff's office leaned heavily on phrases like, "no new developments," and "limited resources." Phone calls were met with the same explanation: nothing further could be done until new evidence appeared. Each conversation left parents with the same hollow conclusion, that without answers, the world expected them to move on. But moving on was impossible when the absence in their lives was still raw, still unexplained. Some family members admitted privately that they returned to the road at night, parking near the curve, staring out at the dark tree line, hoping for any sign they had missed. Those visits became less about finding evidence and more about resisting the idea that hope itself had expired. In town, the case became a story passed between generations. Newcomers to the valley were told about the couple who vanished on the mountain road, their tale folded into the local folklore of accidents, ghost lights, and unexplained disappearances. Teenagers dared each other to drive the road after dark, pointing out the memorial sign with nervous laughter. But for those who had lived through the early days of the search, the story was no ghost tale. It was a reminder of the fragility of safety, how quickly a routine drive home could dissolve into silence that lasted decades. What lingered most was the sense of something incomplete. The case wasn't closed, it was simply unattended, filed away in a drawer no one wanted to open anymore. Yet, certain investigators admitted they would glance at the case file when other work slowed, still convinced that the answers had to be out there. They told themselves that one day, a hunter might stumble across the jeep, or a storm might shift the landscape enough to reveal what had been hidden all along. Until then, it would sit in limbo, too cold to pursue, too haunting to forget. By the 5th year, the families were left with nothing but memories, fading photographs, and the knowledge that no explanation had ever been given. The world around them moved on, but their loss remained suspended in time. And as the memorial aged on the roadside, so did the question that haunted everyone who had ever looked for Brian and Lila. How could two people and an entire vehicle vanish so completely in a place where there was no evidence of crime, no sign of accident, and no trace of departure? That question sat in silence, waiting for the day when something, anything, might disturb it. In the summer of 2023, 21 years after Brian Keller and Lila Rhodes vanished without a trace, a series of storms swept across the valley. Days of relentless rain loosened the soil in the high country, soaking through layers of rock and clay until gravity took hold. On the same stretch of mountain road where the couple had last been seen, a wall of earth and stone gave way, crashing down onto the pavement below. The slide buried the road in boulders, trunks, and mud, severing traffic and forcing state crews to begin a massive clearance operation. To most, it was just another hazard of mountain life, an inconvenience that left drivers rerouted for weeks. But for those who remembered the case, the timing felt uncanny, as if the mountain itself was shifting after decades of silence. As workers pushed debris aside with heavy machinery, one of the operators noticed something unusual protruding from beneath the rubble. It wasn't rock, and it wasn't wood. It was metal, rusted and bent, edges crumpled under the pressure of tons of stone. At first, they assumed it was scrap, maybe a piece of old equipment left from past construction. But as more of the surface was exposed, the shape of a vehicle frame began to emerge, its lines barely visible through layers of dirt and crushed foliage. The discovery brought work to a halt. State police were called in, and soon the road became more than just a cleanup site. It became a crime scene, sealed off to everyone but investigators. Crews worked carefully, peeling back layers of soil and rock with smaller equipment, then by hand. As the vehicle's body came into view, the faded trace of green paint confirmed what some had already begun to fear. It matched the description of the Jeep Cherokee that Brian had driven the night he and Lila disappeared. Word spread quickly, drawing reporters back to the roadside, their cameras aimed once more at the same highway that had carried so much mystery for 2 decades. Families were notified, asked to come in for briefings, their shock mixing with a strange sense of vindication. After 21 years, the vehicle had been there all along, buried so deep beneath the slide that no earlier search had ever stood a chance of finding it. But the relief of discovery quickly gave way to unease. The Jeep was not sitting in the ravine where searchers had expected it might be. Instead, it was embedded beneath the very earth of the slide, positioned at an angle that suggested it had been stationary when the mountain collapsed on top of it. The frame was crushed, the roof caved inward, and windows shattered. Yet investigators studying the scene noted something troubling. There were no broken guardrails nearby, no signs of a recent fall, nothing to indicate the vehicle had left the road violently. Instead, it appeared as if it had been sitting still, caught in place when the hillside came down. The condition of the vehicle raised further questions. Despite the damage from the slide, certain areas seemed oddly preserved. The license plate was still partially legible, enough to confirm it was indeed the missing Jeep. The tires, though deflated, were intact, not shredded as they would have been if the vehicle had skidded or rolled. Even the headlights bore fractures consistent with pressure from above, not forward impact. To those on scene, the picture was unsettling. If the Jeep had been buried in the slide from the beginning, then how had searchers missed it for 21 years? If it had only recently been revealed, what had it been doing sitting motionless on a stretch of road long enough to be overtaken by the mountain itself? The families, brought to the site under escort, stood in silence as they watched crews pull fragments of the Jeep into daylight. For them, it was both an answer and a wound reopened. The vehicle had been found, but the discovery did not resolve the questions they had lived with for 2 decades. It only deepened them. Sheriff's deputies assured them that forensic teams would examine everything, that perhaps the remains of their children would be inside, giving them closure. Yet even as those words were spoken, investigators at the scene were beginning to realize that the case was not closing. It was opening again. Inside the Jeep, the cabin was a compressed shell. Soil packed the interior, glass littered the seats, and tree roots had wormed their way through broken seams in the doors. What searchers expected to find was simple: the skeletal remains of 2 young adults trapped since 2002. But what they found instead left them stunned. In the driver's seat, crushed against the wheel, was a partial skeleton later confirmed through dental records to be Brian Keller. But the passenger seat was empty. No trace of Lila was visible. The realization rippled through the site. The Jeep had been recovered, and Brian's fate had been confirmed. But Lila was still missing. Investigators were left with the unsettling task of explaining how one of them could be buried beneath a mountain of rock while the other left no trace at all. That single fact ensured that what began as a moment of closure quickly transformed into a new chapter of mystery, one that promised to expose more disturbing details as forensic work continued. When investigators finally managed to clear the Jeep from the debris and lift away the crushed metal, the first thing they saw confirmed what many had feared. Wedged against the steering wheel in the driver's seat were human remains, skeletal and compressed from years of weight bearing down. Soil had seeped into the cabin, preserving some fragments and scattering others. Forensic teams worked carefully, cataloging every bone, bagging each piece before moving it. Within hours, dental records provided confirmation. The remains belonged to Brian Keller. After more than 2 decades of unanswered questions, his fate was no longer uncertain. But the relief of knowing was fleeting because one detail was impossible to ignore. The passenger seat was empty. Where Lila should have been, there was nothing. No bones, no fragments of clothing, no jewelry, no trace that she had ever occupied that seat. The empty space raised more questions than it answered. Investigators had expected to find them together, both claimed by the same collapse that had buried the Jeep. Instead, only one had been trapped. Lila's absence cast doubt on every assumption that had been made since 2002. If she hadn't been in the car when the slide came down, then where had she gone? And more disturbingly, why had she not been found in the decades since? The interior of the Jeep told a story that was difficult to piece together. Soil filled the footwells, tangled roots curled through broken vents, and shattered glass from the windshield lay across the seats. But tucked into the glove box was something that instantly drew attention. A portable cassette recorder, its casing cracked, the tape inside warped by time and pressure. At first, it looked like junk, another relic ruined by the collapse, but to investigators, it was a potential key. Devices like this had been common in the early 2000s, often used to record music or personal notes. If Brian or Lila had used it in the hours before their disappearance, it might hold the only direct clue to what had happened that night. The recorder was handled with care and sent to a forensic lab. Technicians studied the tape, noting how water damage and years of compression had distorted sections. Yet parts of the magnetic strip were intact, suggesting that at least fragments of audio might be recoverable. Families were told to brace themselves, that if anything remained on the tape, it could bring answers, but it could also deliver new pain. For the first time since the Jeep had been found, investigators had a tangible lead that might explain why the vehicle had been stopped in such a vulnerable place, angled against the slope rather than continuing safely along the road. Meanwhile, the discovery of only one set of remains pushed the investigation into uncomfortable territory. Some theorized that Lila might have survived the initial slide, escaping before the Jeep was buried, only to disappear in the wilderness. But if that had happened, why had no sign of her ever been discovered during the massive searches? Others suggested she had never been in the Jeep at all, that perhaps she was forced out earlier, separated from Brian before the disaster struck. That possibility carried darker implications, hinting at the involvement of another party, someone whose presence had never been detected in the original investigation. The family struggled with the discovery. Brian's relatives finally had proof of his death, but it came with no clear explanation of how he ended up buried alone. Lila's family was thrown back into the torment of uncertainty, their daughter's face once again staring back at them from missing person flyers, unchanged even though decades had passed. The absence of her remains reopened every wound, and the presence of the recorder suggested the final moments might still be recoverable, yet agonizingly out of reach. For investigators, the scene inside the Jeep was a paradox. It gave them the first definitive evidence in 21 years, yet it also fractured the case into new unknowns. The mountain had revealed part of its secret, but not all of it. The bones in the driver's seat answered one question, but created another that was harder to confront. Lila's absence wasn't just a gap in the record, it was an active mystery, one that suggested she might have had a fate separate from Brian's entirely. As the recorder was rushed to technicians for restoration, investigators knew they were standing on the edge of something critical. For decades, the silence of the mountain had hidden the truth. Now, for the first time, there was a chance that Brian and Lila's final hours had been captured on tape, preserved in a fragile ribbon of magnetic strip that had somehow survived collapse, soil, and time. If the tape could be salvaged, it might explain why the Jeep had been stopped in such a dangerous position, and whether the couple had been alone on that road. And if it revealed that someone else had been there with them, the case would no longer be a question of accident or misadventure. It would be something much darker. The cassette recorder was sent to a forensic audio lab, where specialists worked meticulously to salvage what little remained. The tape was warped, the magnetic strip brittle after decades under soil and stone, but sections could still be coaxed into playing. When technicians finally threaded the tape and pressed play, the room filled with a hiss of static. Beneath it, faint but undeniable, was a voice. It was Lila's. Her tone was strained, almost panicked, and though large portions were garbled, certain words broke through with clarity. She was urging Brian to turn back. Between bursts of interference, the phrase repeated, "Turn back," spoken more than once. Then, more faintly, another chilling detail surfaced. Lila mentioned someone following them. Analysts replayed the fragments dozens of times, straining to catch every nuance. Brian's voice was present too, lower and harder to decipher. At one point, he seemed to dismiss her fears, telling her it was fine, insisting they keep going. The tape crackled and distorted, But the cadence of the argument was unmistakable. One voice anxious, the other firm, unwilling to stop. Just as the exchange grew sharper, the audio cut off with a sudden violent noise. A loud thud, reverberating through the recorder, then silence. Whether it was the Jeep striking something, a door slamming, or an object hitting the recorder itself, could not be determined. After that, the tape went dead. The discovery electrified investigators who had lived with the case for years. It was the first direct evidence of the couple's state of mind on the night they vanished, and it suggested they had been under some kind of threat. The problem was interpretation. Analysts could not say with certainty what the sound represented, or who, if anyone, might have been following them. There was no mention of names, no descriptions, only a sense of fear captured in Lila's voice, and a defiant calm in Brian's. Without context, the tape provided more ambiguity than clarity. When word of the recording reached the families, reactions were divided. Brian's relatives believed the tape pointed to a tragic accident, that his refusal to turn back meant he simply misjudged the danger of the road. Lila's family heard it differently. To them, her words proved she sensed something that night, that someone else had been involved. Both families pressed investigators for answers, but the sheriff's department refused to release the audio to the public. Officials argued it was incomplete, inconclusive, and too fragile to risk circulation. That decision only fueled speculation. Rumors spread quickly that the tape contained evidence of foul play, that authorities were concealing a potential crime. Online forums and local gossip latched onto the fragments. Some claimed the thud was the sound of another vehicle hitting the Jeep from behind, forcing it off the road. Others insisted it was the noise of a struggle inside the cabin, perhaps an intruder climbing into the car. A smaller group speculated the sound had nothing to do with violence at all, that it was simply the beginning of the Rockslide burying the Jeep. With no official statement, theories multiplied unchecked. Each one carried the same haunting implication, that Lila may have been right, that someone really had been following them, and that whatever happened after the tape cut out had erased her completely from the scene. Investigators quietly acknowledged that the tape deepened the mystery rather than solved it. If Lila had been forced out of the Jeep before the collapse, it would explain her absence inside, but it left open the question of where she went and why no trace had ever surfaced. If she'd escaped on her own, she would have been injured, lost, and vulnerable, making it unlikely she survived long in the wilderness. If she had been taken, then the disappearance was no longer an accident, but an abduction layered beneath the tragedy of the slide. None of those possibilities could be proven. All of them kept the case alive. For the community, the existence of the tape reopened a wound that had never fully healed. People began looking back at old rumors with new weight, stories of a hitchhiker seen on the road, headlights spotted at odd hours, a farmer's account of a car idling near his property. What had once seemed like noise now felt like potential evidence, long overlooked. But with 21 years gone, any chance of confirming those details had slipped away. Witnesses had moved, memories had faded, and whatever tracks had once existed were washed clean by time. What the tape did, more than anything, was remind everyone that the silence surrounding the case was not natural. It wasn't the quiet of a couple lost to accident alone. It was fractured by fear, by argument, by a sudden noise that still defied explanation. Police released nothing more, leaving the public with a single, gnawing truth. In the final moments, before the Jeep was buried forever, Lila had felt watched, convinced they were not alone on that road. And the recorder, the one fragile witness to that night, captured her fear but not her fate, ensuring that the mystery of what followed would remain as dark as the mountain that concealed it for more than 2 decades. The recovery of the Jeep and the tape did not settle the case, it reopened it. With Brian's remains confirmed but no trace of Lila, old theories that had once faded into rumor returned with new urgency. Some believed the explanation was simple and tragic, that Lila had escaped the Jeep before it was buried, stumbling out into the night injured and disoriented. If she had wandered into the wilderness, exposure and terrain could have claimed her quickly. But the absence of bones, clothing, or jewelry after 21 years of searching weighed heavily against that theory. The mountain had been scoured countless times. If she'd collapsed nearby, search teams should have found something. Others looked directly to the tape, to Lila's voice pleading for Brian to turn back, her fear of being followed. To them, the evidence was clear. The couple had been pursued. Perhaps another vehicle had tailed them, forcing them into a dangerous position on the road. If they were cornered, Brian may have stayed with the Jeep in defiance, while Lila was pulled away by force. The abrupt thud at the end of the recording seemed to support that idea, though analysts cautioned it could have been anything. Still, it was enough for many to believe the disappearance had never been an accident, but the result of human interference. Family members demanded answers, their grief sharpened by the partial resolution. Brian's relatives wanted closure, but could not understand why only he had been found. Lila's family, still clinging to hope, asked painful questions. If she had been taken, why had no trace of her surfaced in 2 decades? If she had died elsewhere, where was her body? The silence left by her absence was louder than the discovery itself, turning every conversation with investigators into a cycle of frustration and despair. Experts weighed in publicly, debating possible explanations. Some pointed to environmental factors. Animals, they said, could have carried remains far from the site. But that did not explain the absence of clothing, jewelry, or personal effects, which typically linger even when the body does not. Others suggested floodwaters might have washed evidence away during heavy rains, dispersing it beyond the search radius. Yet those who had combed the mountain were skeptical. They had found countless items belonging to strangers over the years, tools, bottles, scraps of clothing, but never a single thing linked to Lila. Her absence felt too complete, too precise. Thus, a smaller group of experts entertained a darker idea: deliberate removal. If Lila had been taken from the Jeep, then someone had made sure she left no trace. Behind that theory raised the possibility of foul play hidden under the disguise of natural disaster. It fit with the tone of her words on the tape and the sudden end of the recording. But without evidence, it remained conjecture, a shadow over an already fractured case. Theories multiplied until they began to contradict each other entirely. If she escaped, why didn't she reach help? If she was taken, how did no one notice for 2 decades? If she died in the wilderness, why had nature left nothing behind? Each explanation carried holes large enough to keep the case from closing. Investigators admitted privately that they were chasing probabilities rather than certainties, trapped between natural causes and human intervention, without enough proof to commit to either. For the community, the mystery grew heavier, not lighter. People who had once driven the mountain road without a thought now slowed at the curve where the Jeep had been uncovered. Some left flowers again at the roadside memorial. Others left notes addressed to Lila, hoping she might somehow see them. The questions spread back through the valley towns where old witnesses were interviewed again, their memories strained by time. But nothing new surfaced. The discovery had given shape to the tragedy, but had not explained it. The families lived in 2 different realities. Brian's relatives buried him at last, their grief final, but their questions still raw. Lila's family, on the other hand, remained suspended in limbo, caught between hope and despair. To them, the absence of her body was proof she might still be alive somewhere. To investigators, it was simply an absence, a gap they could not explain. The search for truth now depended less on what had been found and more on what had not. Why had the Jeep been stationary on that dangerous road? Why had only one of them been inside when it was buried? And most of all, why had 21 years of searching failed to recover even the smallest trace of Lila Rhodes? The answers seemed to sit just beyond reach, leaving everyone with the same gnawing realization. The mountain had given back part of its secret, but the rest remained hidden, waiting for the day when the silence would break again. Forensic crews continued to dig long after the Jeep had been removed, carefully sifting the surrounding soil for anything that might have been overlooked. They cataloged shards of glass, rusted fragments of metal, and soil samples packed tight from decades of compression. Then, in a layer of rock wedged several feet from the Jeep's final resting place. A technician uncovered something small but unmistakable. It was a set of car keys. At first it seemed routine, just another personal item possibly belonging to Brian or Lila. But when investigators examined them more closely, doubts arose. The keys did not match the Jeep. They belonged to another make and model entirely. The discovery triggered a new wave of analysis. Serial numbers were still faintly visible despite years underground, and when they were run through state databases, a match was found. The keys belonged to a vehicle reported stolen from a neighboring county just weeks before Brian and Lila vanished in 2002. That car had never been recovered. The revelation shifted the tone of the investigation dramatically. What had once seemed like a tragic accident, obscured by the collapse of a mountainside, now carried the unmistakable trace of human involvement. For the first time in 21 years, authorities labeled the case not simply as an unexplained disappearance, but as a suspicious death and possible homicide. Theories once whispered quietly in town were now given official weight. Had the stolen vehicle been used to follow the Jeep that night, forcing them to stop at the curve where the soil eventually buried them? Had someone intercepted them, with the slide later masking what really happened? The tape of Lila's voice, pleading with Brian about being followed, suddenly took on a sharper edge. What once sounded like paranoia now aligned with a tangible clue, something that tied their fear to evidence buried in the same hillside. Families who had waited decades for answers found themselves pulled back into the storm. Brian's relatives could at least bury him, though their grief was tangled with anger that his death might have been the result of violence rather than chance. Lila's family received no such closure. For them, the discovery of the stolen car keys only deepened the wound. It gave credibility to the idea that she had been taken, yet it offered no hint of where she had gone. The mystery of her absence loomed larger than ever. Investigators struggled to move the case forward. Records from 2002 were revisited, witnesses re-interviewed, but too much time had passed. People had moved, memories had blurred, evidence that might have once been recoverable was long gone. The stolen vehicle remained missing, and its connection to the couple was circumstantial at best. Still, the timing, the location, and the presence of those keys in the soil where the Jeep had been buried made coincidence difficult to accept. Forensic analysts could not determine how the keys ended up there, only that they had been buried at the same depth and under the same pressure as the Jeep, suggesting they had been present since the night of the disappearance. The press returned to the story, resurrecting headlines that had long gone quiet. News anchors spoke of foul play, of an unsolved abduction concealed by the mountain itself. True crime programs speculated about unknown suspects, weaving theories of road chases and staged accidents. Online communities dissected every detail, building timelines that stretched back to the moment Brian and Lila left the barbecue that summer night. To some, the Rockslide had been fate, a natural disaster that uncovered the truth at last. To others, it had been a cover, a mask over something far darker. Law enforcement walked a careful line. They acknowledged the case was open again, but admitted publicly that they had no suspects, no definitive theory, and no clear answers. Theories ranged from a chase gone wrong to a deliberate staging meant to silence both of them. But each possibility ran into the same wall. Why was Brian found buried in the Jeep while Lila was missing entirely? Why was there no evidence of her in or around the vehicle? And how could someone vanish so completely, leaving nothing behind but fragments of fear caught on a cassette tape? For the families, the discovery of the keys was both validation and torment. It proved that something sinister might have happened that night, that their instincts had been right all along. Yet it also ensured that the case would never feel finished. Each new piece of evidence seemed to open more questions than it answered, pulling closure further from reach. Brian's parents spoke at his graveside of finally knowing where he was, but they also admitted they would never rest until they knew what had happened to Lila. Her family continued to hold vigils, their photographs of her yellowed with age, but their hope was still alive, no matter how fragile. The mountain road itself carried the weight of the mystery. Drivers slowed when they passed the memorial, staring at the bend where a Jeep had vanished for 21 years and where a rockslide had revealed its secret. For some, the discovery of the stolen keys confirmed their fears that the road had never been haunted by accidents, but by people. For others, it remained an open wound, proof that even when the mountain gave back its dead, it would never give the full truth. And so, the case remains unresolved. The Jeep has been found, Brian has been laid to rest, but the stolen keys keep the door open to darker explanations. Was the couple the target of a staged accident, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? Were they chased, forced to stop, only for the hillside to bury the evidence before it could be understood? Or was it something else entirely, a chain of events no one has yet imagined? The answer may never be known. What endures is the question that has haunted two families for more than 2 decades. What really happened to Lila Rhodes on that mountain road, and why has the silence kept her hidden for so long?